At the pharmacy counter, I handed over a $60 bill to cover the medicine of a terrified elderly man standing in front of me. He was trembling, defeated by a system that leaves old folks behind. As the cashier handed back my change, the frail man suddenly grabbed my forearm. His grip was shockingly tight. His eyes darted around nervously before he leaned in and whispered a warning that chilled me to the bone. He said, "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I was confused, but I listened. The next morning when I looked out into my yard, my knees nearly buckled at what I saw. My name is Harwick Pruitt. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I live a quiet life in suburban Oregon. For 40 years, my hands were calloused from gripping steel rebar and gauging the integrity of heavy structures. I spent my adult life laying down foundations built to withstand earthquakes, floods, and the slow grind of time. I believed I understood what it meant to build something that lasts, but not one of those decades in engineering had readied me for the poisonous cracks spreading through the foundation of my own family. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, where we share the kinds of experiences that remind us exactly how far a person can be pushed and what happens when they finally push back. Before we get into today's story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Here's a simple question. To start us off, when someone close to you wrongs, you tend to confront them right away? Or do you prefer to step back, gather your thoughts, and let the truth come out on its own terms? Drop your answer below. There's no wrong choice, and I read everyone. Now, a quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Since my wife passed 3 years ago, I have lived alone in the house we built together. It is a large home, ringed by ancient oak trees that shed a mountain of dry leaves every autumn. Keeping up with the yard gave my old hands something useful to do, and kept my thoughts away from the vacant chair at my dinner table. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when I drove my pickup down to the local pharmacy for my cholesterol medication. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, shaking off the autumn chill. Ahead of me in line stood an elderly man. He looked terribly frail in a faded navy coat that hung loosely off his stooped shoulders, nervously picking through a battered wallet. His spotted hands trembled badly as the young cashier politely told him he was $38 short for his heart medication. I stood back and watched. He looked frightened, desperately patting his empty pockets for stray dollar bills that simply were not there. I know what it feels like to be invisible to the world as you age, to feel like a burden nobody wants to carry. I stepped forward, drew a $60 bill from my money clip, and set it on the counter. I told the cashier to apply the difference and keep what was left. The old man turned slowly to face me. His face was deeply weathered, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. I expected nothing more than a quiet thank you. Instead, he fixed me with a haunting, desperate intensity that raised the hairs on the back of my neck in an instant. He reached out and clamped down on my forearm. For a man who looked like a stiff wind could knock him flat. His fingers dug into my thick canvas work jacket, with the grip of a drowning man seizing his last lifeline. He pulled in close, his breath rattling wetly in failing lungs, and whispered those words straight into my ear. "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I went completely still. The cashier was occupied bagging pill bottles, entirely unaware of the strange exchange unfolding right in front of her. I looked down at the old man, my analytical mind scrambling for some rational explanation. How on earth did he even know I had a son? I had never laid eyes on this man before in my life. Our town is small, but not that small. And why would a total stranger concern himself with my yard work? I opened my mouth to demand how he knew anything about my private family. But before I could get a single word out, he snatched the pharmacy bag off the counter, released my aching arm, and practically bolted for the exit. He moved with frantic, paranoid energy, throwing nervous glances over his shoulder before shoving through the glass doors and vanishing into the cold, gray afternoon. I stood there in stunned silence, collected my bag from the cashier, and said nothing. The drive home felt like a disorienting haze. The truck's heater was running full blast, yet I could not shake the frozen feeling spreading through my chest. My son Nolan is 38 years old, a commercial real estate developer, an aggressive businessman, always chasing the next lucrative deal. He and his ambitious wife Celeste live in a modern luxury townhouse in the city, about an hour from my quiet street. They rarely come out to see me unless a major holiday obligates them to, or unless there is something they need from me. The deeply unsettling fact that a terrified stranger at a random pharmacy had mentioned my son and my backyard in the same breath felt like an impossible riddle. A civil engineer's brain is wired for pure logic, but there was no logic here, only a creeping dark intuition coiling around my heart, telling me something was very wrong. I turned the last corner onto my street, my tires grinding over fallen leaves as the familiar shape of my house appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. The confusion I had been carrying instantly hardened into a heavy stone in my gut. Parked squarely in the center of my driveway was a sleek, immaculate black luxury SUV, Nolan's car. My pulse jumped. Nolan never appeared on a random Tuesday afternoon, and he certainly never drove all the way out to the suburbs without so much as a phone call. I eased my truck in, slowly cut the engine, and sat in the sudden quiet of the cab. Through the dusty windshield, I could see them plainly. Nolan and Celeste were standing together on my elevated front porch, not turned toward the driveway to welcome me the way family does. They were positioned near the wooden railing, wholly absorbed in studying my sprawling, leaf-covered backyard. Nolan was pointing at the ground with his index finger, tracing some invisible calculated line across the property as though he were laying out a new development site. Celeste stood close beside him, a thick stack of glossy brochures held in her manicured hands. But it was the expressions on their faces that made my seasoned blood run cold. They were smiling. Not the warm, easy smiles of a son and daughter-in-law making time for an aging father. These were cold, deliberate, predatory smiles. The very same hungry look an opportunistic contractor wears right before he tears down an old building to put up a profitable high-rise. I sat motionless in the silent cab, hands locked on the steering wheel, the old man's urgent warning echoing in my head. After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden. I drew a long, slow breath, steadied my nerves, and pushed the heavy truck door open to meet whatever dark business my own flesh and blood had carried to my doorstep. The door slammed behind me. Walking up that driveway felt like crossing into enemy territory. Nolan and Celeste turned their predatory smiles dissolving instantly into rehearsed warmth. Nolan came forward and clapped my shoulder with polished enthusiasm, claiming they had stopped by on impulse to take me out to dinner. I knew my son. Nolan never did anything on impulse. Every move he made was a calculated investment. I unlocked the door and let them in. The air inside felt immediately dense, thick with something unspoken. I went to the kitchen to warm the dinner I had already prepared while they settled at the table. When I carried the plates out, I studied them carefully. My years in structural engineering trained me to look for stress points in every foundation. Looking at my son and his wife, I could see a fragile facade. Nolan wore a tailored suit that cost more than my first truck. A silver chronograph gleamed on his wrist. Celeste was draped in designer silk, her fingers stacked with diamonds. As I set the plates down, my mind wandered back to how Nolan was raised. My late wife and I worked without rest to give him an honest childhood. We saved for years to put him through college, driving old cars and eating simple meals so he could study without the weight of student loans. We taught him what a dollar was worth. We believed we had raised a man of integrity. And yet, sitting across from me now, cutting into his food with that air of arrogance, he looked like a stranger. He looked like a man who had decided money was the only thing worth worshiping. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the sharp clink of silverware against porcelain, the only sound in the room. Then, Nolan cleared his throat and exchanged a loaded glance with Celeste. He reached into his expensive briefcase and produced a stack of glossy brochures, sliding them deliberately across the polished wood toward me. The bold lettering on top read, Ridgecrest Pines Manor, Luxury Assisted Living. I looked down at them and felt a cold knot pull tight in my stomach. Nolan leaned forward, his voice settling into a tone of practiced patronizing concern. He said that he and Celeste had been discussing my living situation. He pointed out the house was far too large for one person to keep up with, particularly a man my age. He said they worried about what would happen if I had a medical emergency. He described Ridgecrest Pines Manor with enthusiasm golf course medical staff on call, a vibrant community. He dressed the whole idea up as a permanent vacation, a well-earned reward after a lifetime of hard labor. Celeste reached across and laid her perfectly manicured hand over mine. Her skin felt unnaturally cold against my warm knuckles. She tilted her head, her face arranged into an expression of manufactured syrupy sympathy. She said softly that they only wanted what was absolutely best for me. Then she looked me straight in the eyes and delivered a line that turned the warm blood in my veins to ice. "You should not be out there raking leaves at your age, Dad. It is incredibly dangerous. You could easily slip and fall, and absolutely no one would even know." The words settled into the air, quiet and heavy and deliberate. Raking leaves. My mind snapped straight back to that terrified, shaking old man at the pharmacy counter, his desperate grip crushing my forearm, his raspy voice pleading with me not to rake the leaves after my son left. It was an impossible coincidence to dismiss. Celeste could have said something about shoveling snow, or clearing the high gutters, or patching the roof, but she chose the leaves, specifically, deliberately. The exact same obscure detail the frightened stranger had warned me about only a few hours earlier. My heart hammered against my ribs, but 4 decades of managing high-pressure construction disputes had trained my face to give nothing away. Not one flicker of my internal panic made it to the surface. I slowly, deliberately drew my hand back from beneath Celeste's cold palm. I picked up the glossy brochures, tapped them into a neat stack, and slid them back across the table directly to Nolan. I kept my voice low-measured and completely empty of emotion. I told them I genuinely appreciated their concern, but I was perfectly comfortable right where I was. I reminded them both that I had built this house with my own hands, and I had no intention of walking away from it. My health was sound, my mind was sharp, and I took real satisfaction in maintaining my own property. The subject, I told them, was closed. Nolan's jaw tightened. The warm mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, and a flash of raw frustration burned through underneath. He started to push back harder to press his case, but Celeste drove her foot into his leg under the table. I caught the subtle shift in her posture. She threw him a sharp, loaded look that told him without a word to stand down. Nolan swallowed it, forced the pleasant smile back onto his face, and said smoothly that they understood completely that the option at Ridgecrest Pines Manor would always be there if I ever had a change of heart. The rest of the dinner was excruciating. Whatever thin conversation remained dried up almost immediately, replaced by a suffocating tension that settled into every corner of the room. The moment the meal was finished, they were suddenly in a tremendous hurry to leave. The visit ended the instant the pitch failed. I rose to clear the table, carrying the plates toward the sink. As I turned my back, I caught the microwave door's reflective surface out of the corner of my eye. In the distorted image, I could see Nolan typing furiously on his phone, thumbs flying with unmistakable urgency. His face was pale and tight with sweat. This was not a casual text. He was firing off a warning to someone. I turned the cold tap on, letting the rush of water cover any sound I made. I leaned over the stainless steel sink and looked out through the window into my backyard. The sun was sinking low, throwing long, dark shadows across the lawn. An autumn breeze moved gently through the thick carpet of unraked brown and orange leaves blanketing the ground. But as my eyes swept the edges of my property, my breath snagged in my throat. Running straight across the grass from the back gate, directly toward the largest pile of fallen leaves, were deep tire tracks, heavy vehicle treads pressed hard into the damp, soft earth. Those tracks had not been there when I left for the pharmacy that morning. Someone had been in my backyard without my knowledge or permission. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the worn leather armchair near the living room window, nursing cold black coffee and watching moonlight spill long, deceptive shadows across the unraked leaves below. My mind, trained for decades to calculate load tolerances and structural stress, was now working to calculate the weight of my own son's betrayal. The tire tracks gouged into the grass were an undeniable anomaly, a glaring fault line in the quiet equation of my retirement. As dawn broke at last, painting the suburban Oregon sky in pale, washed-out grays, I heard the floorboards creak heavily above me. Nolan and Celeste were awake. I stayed perfectly still in my chair, taking in the muffled sounds of their morning routine. I heard the sharp click of Celeste's designer heels on the hardwood, then the low murmur of Nolan's voice as he spoke on his phone, hushed, clipped, and all business. At exactly 7 more in the morning, they came down the stairs. I let my stiff muscles go loose and arranged my face into the look of a tired, oblivious old man. Nolan came into the kitchen, dressed in another immaculate suit, dropping his empty disposable coffee cup into the stainless steel trash can by the counter without a second glance. He gave me a warm smile, said he had a full day ahead at the development firm, and promised to check in on me later. Celeste offered one of her saccharine, hollow smiles and reminded me to give the Ridgecrest Pines Manor brochures some serious thought. I nodded slowly and gave them a weary wave as they headed out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I waited exactly 5 minutes. I watched from the window as Nolan's black SUV reversed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. Once I was certain they were gone, I exhaled a long, heavy breath. Keeping up that performance had been exhausting. I got up and walked into the kitchen. My gaze went straight to the trash can where Nolan had tossed his cup. A sharp instinct, a quiet nudge of suspicion pulled me toward it. I stepped over and lifted the plastic lid. Resting on top of yesterday's newspaper was Nolan's crumpled paper cup, but it wasn't empty. Wedged inside the cardboard sleeve was a tightly folded, crumpled piece of heavy paper. I reached in and pulled it free. My calloused fingers knew the texture immediately. High-grade architectural drafting paper. My pulse began to build slow and steady against my ribs as I carried it over to the granite island. I smoothed it out carefully under the bright kitchen lights. I reached for my reading glasses and put them on. For 40 years I had read blueprints, city grids, and topographic surveys the way other men read the morning paper. What lay in front of me was not a general zoning map. It was a highly detailed, precisely rendered topographical scan. And the boundaries on that page were ones I knew intimately. I traced the black ink lines with my fingertip, my breath tightening in my chest. It was my property, my house, my driveway, my sprawling backyard rendered with professional precision. The scan was covered in red ink annotations. Someone had taken careful measurements of soil density and elevation changes throughout. But what turned the blood in my veins to ice were 3 large red X marks drawn directly over the deepest pile of unraked leaves near the back fence. Beside those marks, written in Nolan's unmistakable aggressive handwriting, were 2 words: excavation target. The grief I had been carrying since my wife died evaporated in that single moment. It did not become sadness. It became solid, impenetrable ice, an excavation target, on my own property, surveyed without my consent. The heavy machinery tracks from the night before suddenly made terrifying sense. Someone was coming to dig up my land. I stared at the red ink as my mind rapidly reconstructed the timeline of the past year. 6 months ago, Nolan had been going under. His commercial development firm was hemorrhaging money buried in lawsuits and massive debt. He had come to me desperate and sweating, asking for a loan. I had refused to hand over a blank check, offering instead to help him restructure his operations. He left furious, but then, almost overnight, every financial problem he had simply vanished. Debts paid off. The luxury townhouse purchased. The expensive suits, the spotless SUV. He claimed he had landed a major confidential investor right around that same time, and it was right around that same time that his sudden urgent concern for my mortality began. 6 months ago, he started pushing hard for me to update my will. He brought lawyers to the house, pressing me to sign documents granting him full power of attorney over my estate, framing it all as simple, sensible planning for the future. He wanted total, unrestricted control over this specific piece of land. I stood motionless in the silent kitchen, looking down at the blueprint that told me my own flesh and blood no longer saw me as a father. They saw me as a temporary obstacle sitting on top of a valuable secret. Nolan did not want me in an assisted living facility because he was worried about my health. He wanted me out of the way so he could tear up my backyard without anyone interfering. The terrifying question was no longer what they were doing. The question was what exactly was buried beneath those unraked leaves that was worth burning our family to the ground to get at. That thought was shattered by the sudden piercing shriek of the landline on the kitchen wall. The sound jolted me, my heart slamming against my chest. I stared at the ringing phone for a long beat, my hands trembling slightly. I drew a slow breath, pulled myself together, and lifted the receiver to my ear. I answered with a quiet, careful hello. The voice on the other end was panicked, breathless, coming in ragged bursts. It was the pharmacy manager I recognized from my years as a regular customer. He asked if I was the man who had covered the elderly gentleman's medication the previous afternoon. A cold knot tightened in my gut as I quietly confirmed that I was. The manager's voice cracked with undisguised fear as he said his next words. He told me the police had just shown up at the plaza. Mr. Cranwell, the frail old man I had helped, had been discovered in the narrow alley running behind the pharmacy. He had been savagely beaten and left there clinging to life in a pool of his own blood. I let go of the receiver. It struck the granite countertop with a loud clatter, and I did not reach back for it. I snatched my keys from the hook and ran to my truck with an urgency I had not felt in years. The drive to the county hospital came and went, in a smear of traffic lights and hard braking. My mind, normally a disciplined engine of logic and structure, was spinning loose. For 40 years, I had calculated the breaking points of steel, but I had no formula for this. A frail man I had spoken with for exactly 2 minutes was now fighting for his life in a hospital bed, beaten nearly to death for daring to warn me about my own son. When I threw the truck into park near the emergency entrance, the cold night air hit my face like a fist. I pushed through the sliding glass doors into the harsh fluorescent glare of the waiting area. A security guard near the triage desk asked for identification and patient relation. I had no patience for bureaucratic process. I drew myself up to my full height, calling on the commanding authority I used to project on major construction sites, and told him with complete conviction that I was Everett Cranwell's older brother. I needed to see him immediately. The guard wavered clearly, thrown by my tone, and directed me to the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. I did not wait for any further instruction. I moved past him at a clip, my boots striking the polished floor with heavy, purposeful thuds. The intensive care unit was a bleak tangle of hushed corridors and softly beeping monitors. The sharp smell of antiseptic stung my nostrils as I worked my way through the winding hallways. His room was at the far end of the hall. Peering cautiously through the small glass window in the door, my heart dropped straight into my stomach. Mr. Cranwell looked impossibly small against the large hospital bed. His face was a ruin of deep purple, black, and yellow bruising. Plastic tubing and wires ran from his arms and chest, connecting him to a bank of monitors that pulsed with a fragile, unsteady rhythm. I eased the heavy door open and slipped quietly into the dim room. The mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only thing breaking the thick silence. I stood beside his bed and looked down at his battered hands, the very same spotted hands that had clamped around my arm with such desperate force just the day before. A wave of profound guilt and white-hot anger moved through me all at once. This man was innocent. He was collateral damage in a dirty game being played out in my own backyard. I leaned close and said his name softly, hoping my voice might cut through the fog of trauma and pain medication. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. Then slowly his swollen eyelids stirred. His bloodshot eyes drifted around the room before settling on my face. A weak flicker of recognition surfaced in his gaze. He tried to lift his head from the pillow, but whatever strength he had left was already spent. I laid my hand gently over his and told him quietly to stay still. His chest rose and fell with a wet, labored breath, fighting against the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. His fingers closed weakly around mine. His cracked lips parted, and he pushed the words out with visible, agonizing effort. He gasped, his voice barely a fractured whisper. "Nolan's partners. They needed a clean name. The soil." A violent cough tore through his body, rattling his fragile frame. He squeezed my hand one final time, his eyes wide with a lingering, desperate terror. He tried to speak, tried to finish the warning, but his body gave out. The monitors beside him erupted into a deafening, shrill alarm. The steady lines tracking his heart dropped into a jagged spike, then flattened into a solid, unbroken flat line. The door burst open behind me. A team of doctors and nurses poured into the room, calling out medical codes and shouldering me away from the bed. I stumbled backward into the bright corridor as the privacy curtain swung shut, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with the flatline alarm still echoing in my ears. I walked out of that hospital feeling completely hollow, and yet my mind was moving with cold, terrible clarity. Outside, the night wind cut hard against my jacket as I sat in the truck's cab, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Nolan's partners, a clean name, the soil, the broken pieces of this puzzle locked together with a sickening snap. My son's commercial real estate development firm was not a legitimate enterprise. It was a front carefully constructed and deliberately maintained. I thought back to the financial ruin he had been drowning in 6 months ago and the miraculous overnight recovery that followed. He had gone into business with a violent criminal syndicate. They were running dirty money through large-scale construction projects and needed a credible, untouchable face to anchor the whole operation. They needed the clean reputation of a retired civil engineer with 4 decades of unblemished public service. They needed my name. A vivid, nauseating memory surfaced. 2 weeks ago, Nolan had arrived with a thick stack of manila folders. He told me smoothly they were routine tax documents tied to my late wife's remaining estate. He had been impatient, hovering at my shoulder, pointing out exactly where to sign. I had trusted my son without question. I signed through the entire stack without reading the fine print. I had unknowingly signed away the legal rights to my own property and put a target squarely on my own back. I drove home in complete silence, the truck radio off my mind, methodically mapping every structural weakness in my son's arrogant plan. He genuinely believed he could use me as a human shield, a disposable asset positioned between himself and his violent partners. He thought I was just a worn-out old man, quietly waiting to be placed in an assisted living facility and forgotten. I turned slowly into my dark driveway, the familiar shadows of the cul-de-sac offering no comfort tonight. I climbed the concrete steps to the front porch and reached into my coat pocket for my keys. But the moment my hand closed around the cold metal of the doorknob, my blood went to ice. The heavy oak door was already unlocked. The deadbolt had been disengaged. I pushed it open slowly and stepped into the pitch-black foyer. I held my breath and listened to the silence pressing in around me. Then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps bearing down on the floorboards directly above my head. They moved with slow, methodical weight along the upstairs hallway, advancing toward the closed door of my private home office. I stood frozen in the dark foyer, my heart hammering a hard, violent rhythm against my ribs. My own son was moving through my house like a common thief. Every instinct I had screamed at me to charge up that staircase, kick the office door in, and demand answers. I wanted to grab him by the lapels of that expensive suit and shake the truth loose. I wanted to ask him why a kind, innocent old man at the local pharmacy was lying in an intensive care unit fighting for his life simply because he had tried to warn me. But I forced the burning anger down. I locked it behind a wall of cold, calculated steel. 4 decades on volatile construction sites had taught me something fundamental. Acting on raw emotion during a critical structural failure leads to catastrophic collapse every single time. Patience was not merely a virtue in my profession. Patience was a survival requirement. I needed to stop Nolan, but I could not let him know I had already seen through his web of lies. I needed to play a very specific role. I glanced down at the small entryway table beside me. Resting near the edge was a hand-painted clay pot that my late wife had brought back from a trip to the mountains. I took a slow, steadying breath, reached out, and deliberately knocked the clay pot off the edge of the table. It struck the hardwood floor with a deafening crash that rang through the silent house like a gunshot. The footsteps above me stopped cold. A suffocating stillness fell over everything. I let out a loud theatrical groan, shuffled my boots against the floorboards, and called out into the dark. I asked if anyone was up there, my voice carrying just the right tremor of a frightened, disoriented old man. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing. Then the office door clicked open. The staircase groaned under slow, careful weight. Nolan came down into the dim light of the foyer. He was breathing hard, his face flushed and pale at once. His necktie was pulled loose, and a fine, nervous sweat covered his forehead. He flinched visibly when he spotted me standing among the shattered clay fragments. He scrambled to assemble a believable story, stammering that he hadn't expected me back so soon. He claimed he had left an expensive fountain pen in my home office during his visit earlier, and had only stopped by to retrieve it. He held up empty hands and offered a weak, stumbling laugh, saying he must have left it at his own office after all. I looked directly into his lying eyes. The urge to grab him by the collar and drive him into the wall was nearly blinding. I thought of the afternoons I spent teaching him to ride a bicycle on this very street. I thought of the tuition checks and the sacrifices made so he could have a future, and here he stood treating me like a foolish obstacle. But my restraint held. I channeled the same disciplined focus I applied when engineering suspension bridges under pressure. I knew that letting a single crack show in my facade would compromise the entire structure. I did not challenge the absurd story about the pen. Instead, I let my shoulders drop forward in exaggerated, weary defeat. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand and pushed out a long, heavy sigh that sounded convincingly broken. I looked down at the shattered remains of my late wife's clay pot scattered across the floor, then looked back up at my son. With a voice heavy with manufactured sorrow, I told him I was simply getting too old and too clumsy to handle a house this size on my own. I let the silence sit for a moment before delivering the exact bait I knew he was desperate to swallow. I said quietly that maybe he and Celeste had been right. Maybe it was time to take a serious look at that luxury care facility they had brought up. The transformation in Nolan was immediate and stomach-turning. The coiled, panicked tension drained from his shoulders in an instant. The tight lines around his mouth softened into a wide, triumphant smile. He was convinced he had finally broken me. He stepped forward and laid a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder, performing the role of the devoted, concerned son with a chilling perfection. He said gently that it was a very wise decision, that he would personally take care of all the paperwork, so I wouldn't have to worry about any of it. He promised to call tomorrow to sort out the details. With his immediate goal apparently secured, Nolan moved toward the door, quickly practically jogging out into the cold autumn night. I stood motionless in the dark foyer and listened as his heavy vehicle backed out of the driveway and accelerated down the street. The moment his engine faded into the distance, my defeated posture disappeared entirely. I stood up straight. My mind shifted from the role of a vulnerable old man back to that of a calculating engineer. I left the broken clay fragments where they lay and went straight up the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. I entered my home office and hit the overhead light. I stood in the center of the room and let my eyes work through every detail. I checked the filing cabinets, the desk drawers, the personal safe. Nothing had been taken. Every financial document, every family photograph, every personal record sat exactly where I had left it. Nolan had not come here tonight to take something from me. He had come here to leave something behind. I walked the room's perimeter, slowly scanning for any structural anomaly. Near the far corner, I found it. My heavy solid oak bookshelf, which had stood flush against that wall for over 20 years, was sitting a fraction off its mark. The edge had shifted out perhaps 1/4 of an inch, leaving a thin, dark shadow along the baseboard. I gripped the thick wooden frame and pulled the shelf away from the wall. I took a steadying breath and looked at the floor. Tucked into the narrow, hidden space behind the unit, resting silently on the hardwood, was a thick, industrial-grade metal briefcase secured with dual combination locks. I stared down at it, my mind cycling rapidly through the possibilities. The heavy steel casing and the complex dual dials pointed to something of enormous value, or something enormously dangerous. Every fiber in my body wanted to go to the garage, grab a crowbar, and smash the locks open. I wanted to drag whatever was inside out into the light, but my engineering experience immediately counseled against raw impulse. If I forced those locks, Nolan would know instantly that his scheme had been exposed. He would pivot, relocate his operation, and likely move to have me declared legally incompetent before I could gather a single piece of solid admissible proof. I needed to catch him completely off guard. I needed him caught in the act. I pushed the metal briefcase carefully back into the dark void behind the shelf, gripped the wooden frame, and slid the bookshelf back into its original position with precise alignment. I wiped away the faint scuff marks on the floor with the sleeve of my flannel shirt, erasing any sign I had been there. The trap had to remain entirely undisturbed. I walked out to my pickup truck and drove. I deliberately stayed away from any hardware store in my immediate neighborhood. The clerks knew my face, and I could not afford for word of my purchases to reach anyone asking questions. Instead, I drove 45 minutes down the interstate to a large hunting supply store 2 towns over. The place smelled of leather canvas and gun oil. I went straight to the outdoor surveillance aisle and carefully selected 4 military-grade motion-activated trail cameras. I made sure to choose models with invisible infrared night vision, high-capacity memory cards, and cellular transmission that could push live video directly to my mobile phone. When I set the equipment on the checkout counter, the young cashier asked if I was after a particularly elusive buck this season. I gave him a tired, easy smile, the harmless old hunter, nothing more. I told him I was trying to catch a destructive predator that had been coming onto my property under the cover of darkness. I paid in cash, no digital footprint, loaded the bags into the car, and drove back to my quiet suburban street as the cold autumn sun bled out below the horizon. By the time I swung into the driveway, the sky had gone the color of a deep bruise, purple bleeding into charcoal. I grabbed the bags and went straight to the backyard. A biting wind tore through the stripped branches, rattling the thick canopy of ancient oaks standing guard along my property line. I unpacked the sleek camouflage-painted cameras and buckled the heavy utility belt around my waist. Glancing up at the nearest towering oak looming over that unraked mound of leaves, a sharp bolt of pain fired through my lower back. 70 years old. My joints had opinions about vertical exertion, and they were not shy about sharing them. but the moment my hands closed around the lowest thick branch and I hauled myself upward, something older than the pain took over. Long before I was a civil engineer, I was a young infantryman. My body retrieved the old programming automatically, the discipline of moving silently through hostile ground, the combat-trained willpower that lets you treat physical agony as background noise. I climbed into the dark canopy, rough bark raking across my calloused palms. When I reached the right vantage point, a memory detonated behind my eyes with the force of something physical. 30 years younger, on a bright Saturday afternoon, standing in this exact oak, I remembered reaching down and pulling a laughing, gap-toothed little boy up onto the branches. Hours spent teaching a young Nolan how to read a safe foothold, how to shift his weight without losing his balance, how to stare down the fear of heights and win. I had looked at that innocent, joyful child with a pride so big it hurt. Now, decades on, I was hanging in the freezing dark of those same branches, methodically installing covert surveillance equipment to catch that same boy committing serious federal crimes. The distance between the child I raised and the man he had become pressed down on my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I swallowed the grief bitter and dense and locked my focus back onto the mission. I fixed the first trail camera tight against the trunk, the infrared lens aimed squarely at the leaf pile where Nolan and Celeste had stood, pointing earlier that day. I verified the cellular feed, checking the crisp night vision image on my phone screen, then moved tree to tree in silence, pushing through the burn in my knees, the tightness in my hips, the deep ache across my shoulders, until all 4 cameras sat in position, covering every angle of the excavation site. The entire backyard had become a monitored, inescapable grid. I finally dropped from the last tree boots, meeting the soft, wet grass with a muffled thud. I dusted loose dirt from my thick canvas work jacket and allowed myself one moment of grim, quiet satisfaction. The trap was set. I turned toward the house, ready to let my body rest. But on my very first step toward the back patio, a blinding white flash tore open the darkness. The motion sensor floodlight above the front driveway had fired. I went completely still, heart lurching into my throat. The sudden glare threw long, jagged shadows up the face of my brick house. I pressed against the wall, staying deep in the dark fringe of the yard, and edged to the corner to look. A massive jet-black SUV with heavily tinted windows was rolling to a slow, nearly silent stop directly in front of my property. Not Nolan's vehicle. This one was unmarked, aggressively large, and carried something menacing in the harsh white light. The engine idled with a low guttural vibration that seemed to travel through the cold earth and up into my boots. I stood frozen in the autumn shadow, breath rising in quiet plumes, watching the vehicle sit there with a dangerous patience I hadn't anticipated arriving this soon. I pressed my spine hard against the freezing brick. That vibration moved through the soil, through my soles, up into my legs. I couldn't stay exposed in the side yard. If the floodlight caught even a slice of my shadow, the network I'd just spent hours building in those trees was finished. I moved in agonizing slow motion, sliding my boots across the wet grass, placing each step with total precision. No snap twig, no sound. I slipped through the heavy wooden gate, eased it shut, and ghosted the back door open. Inside, I pressed the door closed until the deadbolt clicked. I stood in the dark kitchen chest, heaving, willing my breathing to quiet. Moving from memory through the lightless space, I crossed into the living room and crouched low behind the thick velvet drapes framing the front bay window. I opened the fabric by a fraction of an inch, just enough to carve a clear, hidden line of sight to the driveway. The floodlight blazed, cutting through the cold and lighting up the idling vehicle beyond my brick mailbox. Both passenger doors swung open in the same instant, synchronized, deliberate. 2 men stepped into the night air, and every instinct I had filed them immediately as threats. No one would mistake them for real estate developers or city zoning inspectors. They wore sharp, expensive dark suits that had no business in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. They moved with a rigid, calculated precision that sent a cold warning straight through me. The taller one tugged his tailored jacket straight his eyes, making a slow, professional sweep of my property, detached, clinical, mapping everything. The shorter one, stocky and wide through the shoulders, produced a sleek digital camera from his inner pocket and began shooting systematic, rapid frames of the front yard, the roofline angles, the measured gap between my exterior walls and the neighboring fences. They weren't admiring the architecture. They were charting the tactical boundaries of an operational zone. Access points, escape routes, sightlines from the street, everything calculated to ensure privacy when the time came. The taller man reached into his jacket and came out with a large smartphone. He raised it to his face and opened a live video call, then slowly rotated the phone using the rear camera to walk whoever was on the other end through the real-time layout of my property. He panned deliberately across the driveway, then swung the lens toward the wooden gate guarding the backyard as he repositioned on my front walk. The angle of that glowing screen drifted perfectly into my narrow line of sight through the bay window. Even from my position deep inside the dark house, the face on that screen was unmistakable, my own son. Nolan's face filled the frame, his expression wound tight with nervous, greedy anticipation. He was in his home office, comfortable, insulated, while dangerous men worked the perimeter of my front lawn. He was directing them. I watched in silent horror as Nolan jabbed a finger at the screen, gesturing emphatically toward the dark side yard that led straight to that pile of unraked leaves. A wave of cold clarity moved through me, head to toe. The dying words of Mr. Cranwell came back quiet as a heartbeat in that dark room. Nolan's partners. A clean name. The soil. The full shape of it finally emerged. This was not a desperate son reaching for a family inheritance. This was a structure deeply rooted in brutal criminal operation, running at scale. Nolan had sold himself out to climb free of financial ruin, and the men who owned his debt were the kind who needed untraceable ground to bury their worst secrets. They needed quiet residential properties legally held by respectable citizens, with no criminal record, no red flags, nothing to draw attention. My unblemished reputation as a career civil engineer made my home the ideal cover for their operation. Nolan had deliberately steered me into signing those dense legal documents weeks earlier, transferring power of attorney so he could hand these men free run of my private land. He had knowingly offered up his childhood home as a disposal site for a violent syndicate. The full weight of that betrayal pressed down on me like a collapsed structure. He was prepared to throw away my quiet life, my clean name, and my physical safety just to keep up his hollow performance of manufactured wealth. The two men wrapped up their photography of the front exterior and moved with purpose toward the wooden side gate. I tracked them through the narrow gap in the velvet drapes, my aging muscles coiled and ready. They made no attempt to force the gate they already knew. From Nolan, it was bolted from the inside. Instead, they leaned over the top of the wooden slats and peered into the dark stretch of my backyard. The taller one raised the smartphone high, giving Nolan a live digital view of the grounds. The stocky one clicked on a flashlight and drove the beam into the darkness. The hard white light cut straight through the shadows and landed on the heap of dead autumn leaves near the back fence, the exact spot I had just spent hours ringing with hidden cameras. The shorter man swung his leg over the low section of fence and kicked hard at the outer edge of the dry pile. The brittle leaves exploded into the cold air, exposing what had been deliberately concealed beneath. This was not settled garden earth. It was freshly turned, loosely disturbed black soil. The man pulled his leg back and faced his partner. He gave a slow, deeply sinister smile and raised his thumb toward Nolan on the video screen, a clean confirming signal. The call cut off. The two men turned without a word and folded themselves back into the black SUV. The engine fired and the vehicle moved smoothly down the street, swallowed by the dark. I stayed crouched behind the drapes, staring at the spot where they had stood. The puzzle had just locked into place. I knew exactly where the ground zero was. I held my position in the dark living room until the last rumble of that engine dissolved into silence. The immediate danger had cleared, but I couldn't spend the night in a house that had already been scoped. I needed help, the kind that doesn't come through standard legal channels. I needed someone who was comfortable working in the gray space between law and investigation. I collected my keys, slipped out the back door, and moved through the narrow alley to stay out of any lingering line of sight. 4 blocks at a brisk walk under dim streetlights brought me to the pickup truck I'd parked deliberately away from the house. I climbed in, turned the engine over, and pulled quietly onto the deserted highway. My destination was a 24-hour diner out near the county line. 30 agonizing minutes of driving, every mile carrying the image of Mr. Cranwell broken and battered in that sterile hospital bed. When I finally rolled into the cracked asphalt lot, the diner's red sign hummed with a low electric pulse. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the smell of stale coffee. One sweep of the near-empty room, and I found him back corner booth spine against the wall. Aldous was a longtime fishing companion, but long before we ever shared a quiet morning on the water, he had been a highly decorated forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 30 grueling years spent dismantling organized crime syndicates by following their hidden money to its source. A man of very few words, with a mind as precise as a steel trap. I settled into the worn vinyl across from him. No warm greeting, no smile. He simply slid a steaming thermos cup of bitter black coffee across the table and waited. I drew a long breath and laid out everything, keeping my voice barely above a murmur, holding my composure with the same disciplined focus I'd relied on through 40 years of building bridges. I walked him through it methodically, the frightened warning at the pharmacy, the topological scan hidden inside Nolan's coffee cup, the brutal attack on the old man, the heavy metal briefcase locked inside my office, and the two men who had just finished mapping my backyard. Aldous listened without a single interruption. His sharp eyes stayed fixed on my face, processing each piece with the cold, professional detachment of someone who had heard worse and remained unmoved. When I finished, the silence between us had mass. Aldous reached slowly into his worn leather satchel and drew out a sleek, heavily encrypted laptop. He flipped it open, thick fingers moving fast across the keys, pushing past security firewalls and pulling directly from restricted federal databases. The hard blue glow of the screen reflected off his glasses as he ran a quiet, thorough background check on my son's commercial real estate firm. I sat without moving, watching the grim focus settle deeper into his weathered face. 10 minutes of nothing but the soft percussion of keystrokes and the distant drone of the kitchen exhaust fan. Then Aldous stopped. He exhaled heavily, pulled off his glasses, and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with a weighted, sympathetic gravity. Barely a whisper. He told me the situation was considerably worse than anything I had calculated. Nolan's real estate company had been flagged by federal monitors for more than 8 months. It was not a legitimate business. It was a high-volume front engineered to launder massive quantities of illegal cash for a notoriously violent overseas syndicate. Aldous laid out the mechanics. The syndicate fed dirty money into Nolan's firm through fabricated construction contracts and ghost development projects. Nolan would then move that money through real material purchases, effectively scrubbing it clean inside the American real estate market. But the operation had recently evolved. The syndicate now needed secure, completely off-grid locations to temporarily cache large shipments of untraceable physical currency and illegal contraband. They required clean residential properties owned by people with spotless histories to serve as temporary holding sites. My decades-long reputation as a decorated civil engineer made my home the most unassuming, most perfect target they could have chosen. The reality of what my son had done nearly closed my throat. Nolan had deliberately positioned his own father as a human shield between himself and his criminal partners. I stared down at the cold coffee in front of me, the dark surface reflecting back everything I couldn't say. I asked Aldous whether there was any practical way to lock down the property, block them from moving excavation equipment onto the land, while we built enough solid evidence to bring in federal authorities properly. I floated a restraining order or a temporary legal freeze on any structural modifications to the deed. Aldous didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped back to the glowing screen and his fingers moved across the keyboard again, pulling up the publicly accessible county property records for my address. He wanted to check whether Nolan had been reckless enough to file any preliminary excavation permits under my name. As the document loaded, the color left Aldous's face entirely. He went rigid, leaning forward toward the monitor, studying the dense legal text as though he needed to read it twice to accept it. He turned the laptop slowly and pushed it across the table until the screen faced me. I put on my reading glasses and looked. It was the official county deed to my home, the house I had built with my own hands 40 years ago. The house where my late wife and I had raised our family, but the name on the ownership line was no longer mine. According to the legally binding document in front of me, the property had been officially transferred exactly 3 days ago. The listed owner was a faceless, untraceable corporate shell company tied directly to Nolan's commercial development firm. My mind went straight back to the afternoon Nolan had shown up at the house a few weeks earlier. He'd arrived with a thick stack of dense legal papers, pressing hard, insisting they were nothing more than routine tax documents needed to close out the remaining details of my late wife's estate. He had been rushed, almost impatient, pointing out precisely where my signature belonged, and I had trusted him without question. Before I tell you what I uncovered that night and just how far the betrayal actually reached, I want to ask you something. If you slowly realized that someone you had trusted completely had been quietly working against you the entire time, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you hold your silence and let the evidence build? Tell me in the comments. I had signed those documents without a second look. That single act of misplaced trust had handed him unlimited power of attorney. He had turned my own signature into a weapon and used it to strip the property right out from under me. I sat motionless in the diner booth, staring at the glowing screen. The men in that black SUV weren't trespassing on my land tonight. Legally, they were standing on their own ground. I no longer owned the house I had built. I was officially without a home. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me as the full devastation settled in. The deed glowing on Aldis's laptop was proof that my own son had methodically erased my name from my own life. I had spent 40 years building a legacy, pouring sweat and blood into that soil, only to be legally dispossessed by the boy I raised. Aldis watched me with quiet sympathy, his eyes carrying a deep recognition of what betrayal looks like up close. He closed the laptop, a sharp, definitive snap that somehow captured the finality of everything that had broken. He asked me what my next move would be. The shock drained out of me, and something cold and steady replaced it. I told him I intended to give Nolan exactly what he was after, an empty house. I drew my phone from my jacket-calloused hands entirely still. I stepped outside into the biting autumn air. I dialed Nolan's number and rebuilt myself into the frail, worn-down old man he needed me to be. He picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying a tight undercurrent of nervous energy. I let out a slow, heavy sigh, loading every ounce of manufactured exhaustion into my voice. I told him, with a carefully calibrated tremble, that the weight of the past few days had finally broken through my defenses. I admitted defeat. I said that keeping up the property had become more than my aching body could manage, and I was ready to sign the papers for Ridgecrest Pines Manor. He buried his rising excitement under a layer of practiced sympathy. I pressed on, telling him I needed a day or two to clear my head before making such a significant change. I said I was loading up my gear and heading out to Crater Lake for a 2-day fishing trip, a final quiet goodbye to my independent life before moving into the facility. The bait was in the water. Nolan took it without hesitation. He smoothly told me not to give the house a single thought while I was away. He eagerly offered to come by, check the locks, and keep watch over the property. I thanked him with the full performance of a grateful dependent father and ended the call. I drove back to my stolen house to pack my fishing gear. Walking through the front door felt different now. The walls I had painted, the hardwood floors I had laid down myself. The living room where my late wife used to settle in with her evening novels. It all had the hollow quality of a stage set, stripped of its meaning. I went into the garage and pulled my heavy canvas duffel from the high wooden shelf. As I worked through the motions loading the tackle box, the waterproof boots, the insulated jacket, the sting of betrayal came at me again in a fresh wave. My son wasn't only stealing the house and everything it represented financially. He was engineering my disappearance from my own life, rushing me into a facility where my independence would wither away so he could hand the property over to criminals on a clean platter. He was converting my sanctuary into a burial site for their illegal operations. Every zipper I pulled, every buckle I fastened, added another layer to the cold barrier forming around my heart. I was no longer a father trying to reach a son who had lost his way. I was a civil engineer systematically diagnosing a critical structural failure before it brought the whole structure down. I slung the duffel over my shoulder and walked out of the garage without slowing. I didn't give the dark windows or the empty porch a second glance. I locked the front door, fully aware the brass key in my hand was now legally meaningless. I got into the pickup, started the engine, and reversed slowly down the driveway. I made a point of driving visibly toward the northbound interstate ramp, giving anyone watching from the dark a convincing picture of a man leaving town for the weekend. I held that course for precisely 15 miles, moving smoothly through the thin, late-night traffic. Once I was certain no unmarked vehicle had stayed with me, I took a sharp exit and threaded through a series of winding back roads. I looped back toward the southern industrial edge of the county and pulled into an isolated abandoned manufacturing park. Tucked behind a large decaying warehouse sat Aldis's private heavily secured garage. The corrugated metal door rolled up with a quiet mechanical hum as I approached. I drove in and vanished from the outside world entirely. The door came down behind me. The interior of that spacious garage had been rebuilt from the floor up into a serious tactical command center. Heavy blackout curtains blanketed the high windows. Banks of high-resolution monitors glowed against the cold cinder block walls, filling the space with a hard blue light. Aldous sat at a wide folding table, wiring together his encrypted network routers and arranging a bank of digital servers. I dragged a metal chair alongside him and set my secure phone on the table. I synced the device to his master terminal and routed the live feeds from the 4 military-grade trail cameras hidden in my backyard oaks directly onto his screens. The wireless signal locked in fast, and all 4 monitors came to life. The infrared lenses delivered a crisp, high-contrast black and white picture of my empty backyard. The cold wind moved through the bare branches, throwing slow, shifting shadows across the carpet of fallen leaves. We sat in that dark garage, drinking tepid black coffee from paper cups, waiting in the kind of disciplined, complete silence that only men with military experience can sustain. The digital clock in the corner of the primary screen moved forward 1 minute at a time. 11 o'clock came and went without a flicker of movement. 11:30 passed the same way. The tension in that cold room had weight and texture. I kept my eyes on the screens, the monitor glare beginning to burn at the edges. I thought about the frightened old man fighting for breath in a hospital bed. I thought about the architectural drafts folded inside a coffee cup. I thought about the cold, measured smile on Celeste's face when she told me I could easily slip and fall and no one would ever know. Every fragment had found its place. The picture was complete. The stage was cleared and ready. The digital clock rolled to exactly midnight. A sharp alert chimed from the central terminal. The motion sensor on the northernmost oak camera had just fired. I pressed forward, both hands gripping the hard edge of the metal table. On the main monitor, the infrared image shifted as the heavy wooden gate at the far end of my property swung open hard. 2 blazing headlights punched through the black and white feed, sweeping long beams across the wet grass. A massive excavation vehicle pushed slowly into my backyard. It groaned to a stop past the fence line, its tires chewing up the damp lawn. In the cold quiet of Aldous' garage, we both leaned toward the glowing screens. The infrared cameras rendered everything in clean, sharp black and white. It was an oversized tactical transport truck. The engine cut out, dropping my backyard into complete silence. All 4 doors opened at once. Nolan and Celeste stepped out into the freezing dark, followed by the same 2 broad-shouldered men I had clocked earlier. The men moved directly to the rear of the vehicle and threw the cargo doors open. They pulled out 4 reinforced steel shovels and a pair of pickaxes. Manual labor, deliberate choice to keep noise low and the neighbors undisturbed. They moved through the gate in tight formation, boots crushing the brown leaves underfoot. Aldous leaned forward and entered a short key sequence on his laptop. The audio feed opened, pushing sound through the external speakers. Wind through bare branches, the crunch of boots on dead leaves. It all filled the command center. They moved in a straight line toward the large mound of unraked leaves near the back boundary of the property. The taller unknown man kicked the remaining leaves aside in a single hard sweep, fully uncovering the loose, recently disturbed soil beneath. Nolan stood at the edge of the dig zone, gripping his shovel with an uncertain posture. He turned and stared at the dark windows of my empty house, visibly uneasy, clearly wondering whether my story about the fishing trip was actually true. He dragged the back of his hand across his brow, the sweat betraying him. Then a voice cut through the audio feed, sharp, commanding, and stripped of any warmth. It was Celeste. The condescending tone she reserved for me was completely absent. Her voice was pure venom. She snapped at Nolan to stop staring at the dark house and get his shovel in the ground. She told him the syndicate was running on a rigid schedule and that they had no room for his spineless hesitation. I sat completely still, eyes fixed on the monitor, shaken by the transformation. The soft, gentle daughter-in-law, who had rested her cool hand over mine at the dinner table, was a fiction, every bit of it. The woman driving harsh, merciless commands at my son was a hardened operative. She was the engine behind his reckless financial schemes. She was the syndicate's liaison on the ground, and she held his leash tight. Nolan pushed back weakly, muttering that the soil was packed hard and that the cold steel of the shovel handle was already tearing up his hands. Celeste moved into his space, her face close to his. The camera caught every detail of the contempt pulling at her features. She cut him apart without mercy, calling him a weak and pathetic excuse for a man. She reminded him that his financial implosion had nearly gotten them both killed 6 months ago, and that this specific job was the only reason the syndicate had kept him breathing. She told him to dig until his hands bled, that he owed his miserable life to the very dirt he was standing on. Nolan visibly collapsed under the weight of her words. He swallowed it. The businessman facade he wore in public simply fell away. He was a frightened pawn. He drove his shovel into the dark earth. Aldous and I watched in silence as the three men tore through the soil of my backyard. The infrared feed showed the heat radiating off their bodies as they worked. Dark mounds of earth built up fast around the edges of the growing trench. The labor was brutal. Nolan was sucking for air, his chest heaving, but he didn't dare slow down under Celeste's unrelenting watch. She prowled the rim of the deepening hole like a warden, arms crossed, eyes dropping repeatedly to the illuminated face of her expensive wristwatch. The minutes moved with agonizing drag. The hole widened and deepened past 4 feet. A slow burn of anger moved through me. My late wife had planted azaleas in that ground. It was being carved up by criminals. I kept my breathing measured and even. Then a sharp metallic clank rang out through the speakers. The sound of solid steel driving into thick metal cut across the steady rhythm of the shovels. The two men stopped dead. Nolan dropped his shovel and folded to his knees at the muddy edge of the trench chest, heaving smearing wet mud across his pale forehead. Celeste leaned forward over the edge, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. She told the men to pull them out carefully, reminding them the contents were worth more than their lives put together. The two broad-shouldered men lowered themselves into the hole boots sinking into the wet mud. They grunted with the effort, working their hands around thick reinforced nylon straps buried in the loose soil. With a coordinated heave, they hauled a massive object up out of the trench and let it drop onto the grass. It landed with a heavy thud, a large military duffel bag secured with thick steel padlocks. They reached down into the darkness again and wrestled up a second identical bag, dropping it beside the first. Then a third dragged up and dumped onto the torn lawn next to the others. 3 massive bags in a line, radiating a cold, unmistakable menace. I had no doubt what was in them. Millions in illicit currency, highly illegal contraband. The syndicate was moving their buried cash, extracting it from my stolen land. Beside me, Aldous let out a long, quiet breath and said, "We finally had everything we needed." Once they loaded those bags into the truck, he told me we could make the call to his federal contacts. A wave of deep relief moved through my exhausted body. The trap had held. We had them cold. But as I watched the monitors waiting for the men to carry the bags toward their vehicle, that relief vanished fast. They weren't leaving. The 2 men climbed out of the trench and stood beside the retrieved bags. Celeste turned her cold, calculating attention toward Nolan, who was still on his knees in the wet dirt, catching his breath. A short, deliberate nod. Nolan got to his feet. He reached into his ruined suit jacket and produced a thick, tightly bound bundle of documents, white pages wrapped tight in transparent plastic. He stood at the muddy edge, holding the bundle over the open hole. Then he let it go. The package dropped through the cold air and hit the wet bottom of the trench with a dull thud. Through the high-definition audio feed streaming into Aldous' concealed garage, every sound came through with terrible clarity. I sat rigid in my metal chair, eyes locked on the screen, watching my son standing over the muddy pit he dug in the yard where he once played as a boy. The taller syndicate man moved forward and aimed his flashlight down into the hole. The beam found the plastic-wrapped bundle resting in the dark earth. He turned a hard look toward Nolan, his voice a low, dangerous rumble through the laptop speakers. He demanded to know exactly what Nolan had just dropped into the site. He reminded my son sharply that their instructions were only to retrieve the $5 million in currency packed inside the duffel bags, not to leave anything behind. Nolan raised both hands in a settling gesture, working to hold the situation together. His voice trembled slightly, but something ugly and self-satisfied ran underneath it. He told the operative to relax, insisting the buried documents were the key to keeping every one of them out of a federal cell. He pointed down into the trench and announced that he had spent the past 6 months constructing a foolproof contingency for the entire money laundering operation. Celeste stepped out of the shadows, pulling her arms tight around herself against the cutting wind. She gave the syndicate men a conspiratorial smile and told them to listen closely to her husband. She called it a brilliant strategy that would guarantee all of them complete immunity. Nolan straightened, drawing a dark surge of confidence. What came next hit me like physical blows in the quiet command center. He laid out his plan in plain detail. The plastic-wrapped bundle contained meticulously forged financial ledgers. Those ledgers documented every fabricated construction contract, every shell corporation, every illicit transaction the syndicate had run over the past year, a complete paper record of the operation. But here was the mechanism delivered with a cold chuckle. Those ledgers carried none of his names, not Celeste's, not a single active syndicate member. Instead, Nolan announced with something close to pride that he had spent countless hours forging my signature across every page. He had anchored the entire criminal enterprise to my unblemished professional record as a civil engineer. My reputation, he explained to the men, was the ultimate cover, making the fabricated trail read like the tragic unraveling of a highly respected old man running a shadow empire from his suburban home. The shorter syndicate man stood with his thick arms crossed, listening without expression as Nolan walked through the timeline of my destruction. Nolan's voice took on an excited energy as he described the next steps. By tomorrow afternoon, he said he would have me signing the permanent admission papers for Ridgecrest Pines Manor. He told them I was already broken, a tired old man, practically ready to be put away. Once I was safely institutionalized and removed from the property, his masterstroke would begin. He would use an untraceable burner phone to place an anonymous tip directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, directing agents to this address and instructing them to dig near the disturbed soil by the back fence. Celeste cut in, her voice dripping with cruel amusement. She added cheerfully that the authorities would unearth the forged ledgers alongside trace quantities of the physical currency they were pulling out tonight. The FBI would see a sealed, airtight case against a retired engineer who had quietly lost his mind to greed. She laughed, a sharp sound that bounced off the garage walls, predicting the strain of a federal indictment would likely finish my fragile heart before I ever set foot in a courtroom. Nolan nodded along with enthusiasm. He told the dangerous men I would inevitably absorb the full weight of the laundering operation alone. Federally indicted, completely disgraced and dead in a cold prison cell, taking every buried secret with me to the grave. In exchange, Nolan and Celeste would legally inherit my untainted real estate holdings, shielded from the federal fallout, while the syndicate walked away spotless and ready to build their next operation. The taller syndicate man fixed a long, quiet stare on Nolan. The infrared camera caught the slight nod of approval he eventually gave. He offered a grudging compliment on the ruthless efficiency of the plan, saying he'd never figured Nolan had the stomach to sacrifice his own father. Nolan responded with nothing more than a shrug in the cold night air, dismissing my entire existence with a casual wave of his hand. He said business was business, and that I had already outlived whatever practical use I'd ever had. They grabbed the 3 duffel bags and dragged the $5 million across my wrecked lawn. The bags went into the back of the black SUV, doors slammed shut. Nolan and Celeste snatched up their shovels and pushed a layer of loose soil over the plastic-wrapped ledgers, burying the false evidence before hurrying to their vehicle. Within minutes, the driveway stood empty. The motion sensor light clicked off, dropping my home back into darkness and leaving behind a perfectly engineered trap designed to end my life. Inside the isolated command center, the silence hit like a physical force. I sat frozen in my metal chair, staring at the monitors. The black coffee in my cup had gone cold. Beside me, Aldous slowly removed his glasses and exhaled deeply. He didn't reach for any hollow words of comfort. He understood exactly what I had just watched. He knew I had just seen my only son casually sign my death warrant. The deep, suffocating sadness that had threatened to break me disappeared entirely. Whatever lingering hope I'd carried, that Nolan was simply a lost and misguided child, burned away in the cold air of that concrete garage. He was not a victim of his circumstances. He was not being coerced by anyone. He was the deliberate, calculating architect of my destruction. He had engineered a structural nightmare specifically designed to bring me down under its full, inescapable weight. I closed my eyes and took a slow, measured breath. I thought about the great steel suspension bridges I had built across my career, the absolute precision those structures demanded, thousands of tons of concrete holding firm against hurricane-force winds. The careful calculations required to bring down a failing structure without causing damage to everything around it. My son had badly miscalculated my strength. He was convinced I was a weak foundation that would crumble under the pressure he applied. What he failed to understand was that I held the blueprints to tear his entire operation down to bare ground. When I opened my eyes, the grief had cleared, replaced by something cold and fixed. I turned to Aldous, my voice level and stripped of any feeling. I told him it was time to drop the bridge. Aldous didn't hesitate or ask what I meant. He understood the finality of those words completely. He reached across the folding table and drew a heavily encrypted satellite phone from his worn leather satchel. He bypassed standard cellular channels and dialed a direct unlisted line that connected straight to his former colleagues in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. When the call went through, Aldous laid out the situation with clipped military precision. He reported a confirmed high-level money laundering extraction currently underway at a residential address. He detailed the presence of $5 million in illicit physical currency, the active participation of known syndicate operatives, and the live burial of extensively forged federal evidence, giving the call enough weight to leave no doubt about the urgency of the response. Aldous routed our live high-definition infrared camera feed directly to the Federal Operations Center in downtown Portland. The volume and clarity of the evidence hitting their secure screens triggered an immediate overwhelming mobilization. A specialized tactical strike team already on night standby was activated within minutes. Aldous ended the call and quietly closed the encrypted laptop. He turned toward me, his weathered face carrying the particular gravity of a man who had done this before and knew what came next. He told me to stay inside the reinforced walls of his abandoned command center. He warned that the federal raid would be chaotic, dangerous, and fast-moving. He nearly pleaded with me to spare myself the ordeal of watching my only son taken away in handcuffs. I looked back at my trusted friend, my voice steady, every trace of hesitation gone. I was not going to hide in the dark while my stolen house was raided. I told Aldous that Nolan had spent months building a frame designed to leave me rotting in a federal cell for the rest of my life. I needed to be standing on my own property when the trap closed. I needed to look my son in the eyes at the exact moment he understood that his carefully constructed empire had collapsed completely beneath him. Aldous held my gaze for a long moment, reading the stubborn, unbreakable resolve of a father who had run out of room for anything else. He simply nodded, took his keys from the table, and led the way out to his unmarked vehicle. The drive back toward my suburban neighborhood passed in a dense, pressing silence. Cold autumn darkness streamed past the passenger window in a continuous blur. I kept my eyes on the illuminated dashboard, letting the steady hum of the engine hold my thoughts in place. As we moved down the empty highway, a heavy mourning settled over me. Not for the house, not for the financial betrayal. I was mourning the boy I had raised irreversibly, completely. I saw a young Nolan running through the sprinklers on a summer afternoon, his face bright with uncomplicated joy. I remembered teaching him to ride his first bicycle, how to properly bait a hook, how to knot a Windsor tie before his high school graduation. I had given him everything I had, love, discipline, whatever wisdom I'd earned, and poured it all into shaping who he would become. But the hard, brutal truth was that the child I had loved no longer existed. He had been consumed entirely by his own greed, replaced by a cold and calculating man who regarded his father as a disposable piece on someone else's board. That realization tore through me, and it also delivered a strange, cold clarity. I was no longer trying to pull a son back from the edge of his mistakes. I was moving to neutralize a serious threat to my own survival. Protecting what I had built required me to cut the remaining threads of paternal instinct and walk away from them for good. I sealed those untouched memories, the boy, the summers, the laughter, into a locked corner of my mind. The man currently padding forged evidence into the soil of my backyard was a criminal, and tonight was the night he would answer for it. Aldous killed the headlights 3 blocks from my street, gliding the vehicle to a quiet stop near the corner of the neighborhood park. The federal response was already taking shape around us in near total silence. Unmarked black vans and armored tactical vehicles sat at every intersection, sealing every viable escape route from the residential cul-de-sac. Heavily armed federal agents in dark tactical gear moved through the shadows of neighboring yards with speed and absolute quiet. Aldous presented his retired federal credentials to a perimeter guard, and we were waved through to the mobile command unit parked behind a dense line of evergreen trees. We stepped into the cramped, glowing interior of the surveillance van, surrounded by agents tracking the live feeds from my trail cameras. On the primary screen, the scene playing out in my backyard was approaching its final moment. The dark hole in the earth was nearly filled. Nolan stood at the edge of the muddy trench, using the flat of his shovel to press the damp soil firmly down over the buried forged ledgers. He was breathing hard, his expensive suit destroyed by the wet dirt and the effort of the night's work. The two syndicate operatives had already loaded the 3 heavy duffel bags into the rear cargo hold of their idling truck. They stood near the open tailgate, relaxed in their posture, certain they had pulled their illicit wealth clear without tripping a single alarm. Celeste stood close to Nolan, arms folded across her chest, with quiet confidence watching him finish his grim work. The cold wind dragged her hair across her face, but she didn't flinch. She simply watched the earth consume the final piece of their treacherous puzzle. Nolan flung his muddy shovel aside, letting it clatter hard against the wooden fence. He dragged the back of a trembling hand across his dirty forehead and turned to face his wife. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, a massive wave of visible relief washing over his tense features. He gave Celeste a wide, sickeningly triumphant smile, fully convinced he had just sealed his flawless getaway and completed the ultimate destruction of my life. He reached out his hand toward her, ready to celebrate their perfect crime. Then the quiet darkness of that backyard was violently torn apart without a breath of warning. A dozen blinding high-intensity tactical floodlights ignited all at once from every conceivable angle, flooding the entire yard with the harsh, inescapable brilliance of a midday sun, freezing the criminals where they stood in the mud. The deafening crack of a digital megaphone split the freezing night air. FBI dropped the shovels. Put your hands in the air. The booming command bounced off the brick walls of my home. A home no longer mine, but one about to serve as the perfect stage for my son's ultimate downfall. Heavily armored tactical agents swarmed the perimeter with terrifying synchronized precision. They poured swiftly over the wooden fences and surged out from the dark side yards. Assault rifles raised laser sights, carving sharp red lines through the muddy darkness. The 2 broad-shouldered syndicate operatives didn't even attempt a pointless fight. They were seasoned career criminals who immediately recognized the crushing disparity in the tactical force. They dropped their heavy steel pickaxes into the wet grass, raised their empty hands slowly, and laced their fingers behind their heads as they sank to their knees in the mud. They knew exactly how this worked. They accepted their capture with cold, absolute professional resignation. There was no escaping this coordinated federal strike team tonight. Nolan, though, completely unraveled. The blinding glare of the tactical floodlights laid bare the sheer abject terror tearing across his face. He stumbled backward, muddy boots slipping on the slick, torn grass near the edge of the deep trench. The heavy steel shovel fell from his trembling grip, hitting the ground with a dull thud. His carefully constructed facade of arrogant superiority evaporated on the spot, exposing the pathetic, desperate coward hiding beneath it. As the federal agents closed in with a continuous barrage of commands to freeze, Nolan's survival instinct took over. It was an instinct built entirely on treachery and deflection. He threw his hands into the air and launched into a frantic, hysterical stream of lies aimed at the approaching officers. His voice cracked with high-pitched panic as he thrust a muddy finger toward the dark silhouette of my house. "Wait, you have to listen to me," he screamed, the words tumbling out in a rapid, pathetic rush. "It's my dad's property. I swear to God, I didn't know this was here. My dad forced us to dig it up. He was the one behind all of this. He set the whole thing up, planted everything to frame me right here in front of you." He frantically pushed on with his desperate monologue, jabbing a finger down into the deep hole. "Look at the ledgers. The ledgers have his signature. He is the one running this. He is a crazy old man, and he made me do it." Every single word he screamed was a sharp final nail in the coffin of our relationship. He was perfectly willing to send me to a federal penitentiary for the rest of my natural life if it meant he could sidestep the devastating consequences of his own greed. He genuinely believed those wild lies would actually hold. I stepped slowly out from the shadow of the heavy wooden side gate. Aldous walked silently right beside me, his federal credentials displayed prominently on his outer jacket. The armed tactical agents recognized him immediately and parted smoothly, creating a clear, unobstructed path for me to walk straight into the center of my ruined backyard. The tactical lights cast long, sharp shadows across the mud. I did not rush. I moved at the slow, measured, deliberate pace of a man who had fully reclaimed his stolen power, feeling the wet grass compress under the heavy soles of my boots. I paid no attention to the armored federal officers systematically securing the outer perimeter of the crime scene. Every ounce of my focus was locked on the pathetic, trembling man standing at the muddy edge of that freshly dug trench. I stepped into the harsh glowing circle of the floodlights and held perfectly still, letting my presence land. I stood directly in front of my son. Nolan stopped screaming mid-sentence. The hysterical pleas died instantly in his throat. His wide, frantic eyes found my face, and the remaining color drained completely from his cheeks. He went chalk white, looking exactly like a man who had just watched a ghost rise from a cold grave. His jaw worked open and closed without producing a sound, struggling to absorb the impossible reality standing before him. He had meticulously accounted for every variable in his treacherous plan except one. He had arrogantly assumed I was safely miles away, obliviously packing my bags for a miserable life in a nursing home. It had never crossed his mind that the clueless old man he so deeply despised had been the one to engineer this entire federal sting. I stared into his terrified eyes, offering no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no paternal warmth. The emotional bond that had tied me to him for decades was completely severed. I saw him not as my flesh and blood, but as a deeply flawed, highly destructive hazard I had successfully neutralized. He was simply a common criminal facing severe justice. Celeste, who had remained frozen in shock near the open tailgate of the black SUV, suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She correctly calculated that Nolan's pathetic deflection had failed entirely, and her survival instinct demanded immediate flight. She spun sharply her heels, digging into the mud, and made a desperate sprinting dash for the dark gap in the back fence. She didn't even make it 5 YDs. A heavily armored federal agent lunged forward with explosive speed, driving his shoulder squarely into her midsection. He drove her hard into the wet grass, pinning her arms behind her back, with swift, undeniable authority. Her expensive clothing was instantly coated in thick, dark mud as she thrashed and screamed, hurling venomous curses at the arresting officers. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing through the night air finalized her capture. She was permanently detained at last, marking the absolute end of her vicious, highly manipulative reign. Watching his wife driven face first into the dirt shattered whatever fragile remnants of composure Nolan still had. His legs buckled. He collapsed heavily onto his knees in the cold mud, right beside the massive open trench he had dug to bury my reputation. The desperate arrogance that had powered his entire criminal enterprise dissolved, leaving behind nothing but raw, unfiltered desperation. He looked up at me from the dirt, his face streaked with tears and thick mud. The man who had just moments ago tried to send me to a federal prison now abandoned aggressive blame for incredibly pathetic begging. He reached his trembling hands out toward my boots, his voice splintering into a loud, miserable sob. "Dad, please!" he wailed, the agonizing sound cutting through the quiet night. "Dad, tell them, please! You have to tell them it is yours. Tell them you made me do it." I stood over him, posture rigid, expression completely unreadable. The blinding floodlights lit up his terrified, pleading face, but I felt absolutely nothing. The fiercely protective warmth my heart had once carried was entirely gone, replaced by cold, absolute resolve. The mud soaked deep into the knees of his expensive tailored trousers, permanently staining the fine fabric with the very dirt he had proudly planned to use as my financial grave. I looked down at the pathetic, trembling figure groveling at my boots. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the federal tactical lights stripped away every last trace of the polished corporate executive he had pretended to be revealing, only the hollow, terrified core of a desperate criminal. The heavily armed agents held a tight, impenetrable perimeter around us, weapons lowered, but professional attention absolute. The deafening silence of the freezing autumn night was broken only by the ragged, pathetic sound of my son sobbing into the damp earth. The begging never stopped. His voice kept breaking, pitching higher with each second, as his eyes raked desperately across my expressionless face, hunting for any flicker of the fatherly softness he had always counted on manipulating. Even now, pinned by the weight of what he'd done, he couldn't let go of the delusion that he might still talk his way free, that he could somehow persuade a team of federal officers that a frail old man was the criminal mastermind responsible for the mountain of dirty money stacked in that idling truck. He was running on raw panic, his mind refusing to accept that the walls had fully closed. The syndicate men said nothing. They regarded him with the quiet contempt of professionals watching an amateur embarrass himself. I gave him no comfort and no anger. My hand moved steadily into the inner pocket of my jacket. The moment Nolan registered the motion, his frantic words died in his throat. Those wet, frantic eyes locked onto my hand with the pure, unthinking terror of a man watching a trap spring shut. What I drew out was a slim digital tablet, smooth, cold glass against the rough skin of my hands. I navigated to the encrypted server, where Aldous had carefully threaded the live audio from the hidden microphones laced through the backyard canopy. I drove the volume to the ceiling and pressed play with a hand that didn't tremble once. Nolan's own voice, confident, contemptuous, utterly self-assured, spilled out into the cold night air. Every word was immaculate. The recording caught each syllable of betrayal he had delivered, just minutes earlier, clear as a bell. The agents, the handcuffed syndicate men, and Celeste still face down in the wet grass, went completely still as his recorded voice rang through the yard, openly bragging about the forged signatures he had planted on the criminal ledgers. The neighborhood heard him lay out in his own words exactly how he intended to alert the authorities the moment I'd been packed off to a nursing home. And it caught Celeste's laugh sharp and vicious as she savored the image of me rotting in a federal cell. The playback unspooled. His entire scheme leave me to die in a maximum security prison, while he walked away untouched, holding everything he'd stolen from me. That audio hung over the frozen yard like a verdict already read aloud. Nolan didn't move. His mouth was open, his body rigid in the mud, the sound of his own treachery pouring over him like cold water. The color had gone from his face, completely leaving something hollow and caved in, where a man used to be. It was only then that the full weight of it reached him. His backup plan, the one he'd designed to bury me under his own crimes, had been recorded in its entirety and handed to the federal government on a clean digital file. No wiggle room, no technical ambiguity for a high-priced attorney to work with, no angle from which to pin any of this on a confused old man. The lead agent, tall, square-jawed eyes that had seen every variety of liar, moved into the light without a word. He was done with commands. He was done listening. He grabbed Nolan by the collar of that ruined suit jacket and pulled him upright with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Nolan went limp. The agent wheeled him around and pressed him firmly against the cold flank of the tactical truck, and the hard metallic snap of handcuffs biting down around his wrists rang out through the yard with a clarity I will never forget. I stood and watched it happen. Something deep in my chest loosened, not joy, not relief exactly, but the particular weight that lifts when a structure finally finishes collapsing. I moved toward him. One slow step. Nolan rotated his head against the cold metal, his tear-blurred eyes finding mine, for what we both knew was the last time. I hadn't spoken to him since before all of this began. When I finally opened my mouth, there was nothing in my voice, no grief, no heat, just the flat clarity of an engineer reading out the reason a bridge gave way. "You thought I was a clueless old man," I said, keeping it low, letting it cut through the noise. "But I spent 40 years building foundations that do not crack. You built yours on dirt." Whatever scaffolding was still holding him up came down all at once. He let out a wail loud and ragged and stripped of every pretense. The lead agent seized him by his cuffed arms and marched him across the torn grass toward the row of cruisers, strobing red and blue at the curb. Celeste was wrenched up from the ground nearby, her designer clothes caked beyond saving shrieking curses at anyone within range as she was forced into a separate vehicle. The screaming accomplished nothing. The two syndicate men were walked off in chains, their careers concluded as cleanly and permanently as a circuit being cut. I watched them go. Then I was alone. The backyard was just a backyard again, torn and dark, the trench gaping in the earth leaves plastered to the wet ground. The tactical lights went dark in sequence, and the quiet that came back was the quiet I remembered from before any of this had happened. I didn't linger. I crossed the patio, stepped into the house, and walked through it without pausing. Not in the kitchen, not in the front room. I went straight to the office, moved to the oak bookshelf, pushed the frame aside, and lifted the metal briefcase out of the hollow behind it. I set it on the desk. I worked the dual combination dials sequences I'd reconstructed from my son's deeply predictable numerical habits, and the latches released with a crisp, definitive snap, exhaling stale air into the room. I expected cash. What I found instead was worse for him. Organized inside the padded shell, a dense sheaf of manila folders and a row of encrypted external hard drives. The top folder held the original property deeds to my home, clean untouched, carrying none of the forged marks or shell company language Nolan had used to strip them away. Below those sat the syndicate's actual ledgers, and they were thorough. Nolan had logged every transaction, every ghost contract, every dollar washed through the operation, with the obsessive precision of a man who trusted no one and wanted leverage over everyone. That was exactly what it was: leverage, his personal failsafe. A weapon he kept loaded and pointed at his handlers in case they ever decided he was expendable. He'd calculated that he could offer me up to the authorities as a sacrifice while keeping the syndicate under his thumb with their own documented crimes. The arrogance required to believe that was possible was breathtaking, and all of it was sitting right here in documented form. I didn't read through it. That wasn't my job. I closed the case, snapped the latches, and carried it out front. The lead agent was on the porch steps managing the tail end of the scene, the street behind him still washed in alternating red and blue. I walked up to him and put the briefcase in his hands, then met his eyes and told him plainly what was inside. The hard drives, I explained, held the unaltered financial record of the entire laundering operation, untainted by the fabricated evidence Nolan had staged in my yard. Something shifted in the agent's face. The professional hardness softened briefly into something that looked like genuine respect. He told me this would secure my exoneration completely, and beyond that, it would give his team everything they needed to dismantle the overseas syndicate from its leadership on down. He turned immediately and instructed his legal team to begin reversing the fraudulent property transfer without delay. Within days, the fraudulent corporate deed would be fully voided, and my home returned to my name by the law permanently. The sanctuary I had built over a lifetime was finally beyond the reach of those who had tried to take it. I retreated into the quiet warmth of the house, the adrenaline that had carried me through the last 24 hours draining out of me all at once. A bone-deep exhaustion moved in to replace it, settling into my shoulders, stiffening every joint. I made my way slowly through the kitchen and into the small utility mudroom off the back entrance. I lowered myself onto the wooden bench and looked down at my leather work boots. They were packed with the dark mud from the trench those people had cut through my backyard soil, jammed deep into the rubber treads, clinging stubbornly, a tangible record of the violence that had been done to my property. I reached for a stiff brush and a damp cloth and went to work scraping the muck off the worn leather in long, deliberate strokes. Each pass of the brush released some knot of pressure I'd been holding in my chest for longer than I could measure. I kept at it until my hands ached, refusing to quit until the boots were clean. Not a trace of that contaminated earth was going to follow me into the rest of my home. The rhythmic, repetitive work settled my mind the way a controlled demolition settles a structure, methodical, final, everything falling into its proper place. And then, as I wiped the last smear of damp soil from the leather, something hit me with the force of a structural beam giving way. My thoughts snapped back to the bright fluorescent light of the local pharmacy. To Mr. Cranwell, the fear carved into his bruised face, his shaking hands, the way his swollen eyes could barely hold my gaze. Everything that had seemed scattered and senseless suddenly locked into alignment with terrible clarity. Mr. Cranwell had not been the random victim of some street crime. He was a casualty of Nolan's syndicate. He must have stumbled onto their operation, or perhaps his own property had been eyed as a potential burial site before they turned their attention to mine. Either way, he had seen enough to understand the danger closing in around my son, and despite the cost to his own body, he had tried to reach me. That fragile old man had put himself directly in harm's way to deliver that fractured warning about soil and clean names. A wave of gratitude moved through me, deep and heavy and humbling. He had lit the fuse that saved my life. I made myself a promise right there on that bench. First thing Monday morning, I would call the hospital administration. I would cover every dollar of his medical bills anonymously in full, no paperwork pointing back to me, no conditions attached. He would get the best care available without carrying a cent of financial burden for his courage. The long night finally loosened its grip and let the morning through. The harsh glare of the tactical floodlights gave way to the soft spread of early sunlight across the yard. I stepped out onto the front porch with a steaming thermos cup of bitter black coffee, wrapping both hands around it against the autumn chill. The air was clean in my lungs, genuinely clean, in a way it hadn't felt in months. That suffocating weight my son's betrayal had pressed down on me was gone, lifted completely off my tired shoulders. Out on the quiet suburban street, the last pieces of justice were being put in order. I stood on the wooden steps and watched two heavy-duty tow trucks back slowly into the driveway. The federal asset seizure was moving with the same quiet efficiency as everything else had that night. I took a slow sip of coffee and observed the thick steel chains hook onto the front axles of Nolan's black SUV and Celeste's imported sedan. The hydraulic winches ground them up onto the flatbed trailers, those gleaming overpriced symbols of an empire built on stolen money and fabricated paperwork. I watched the trucks roll down the street and disappear around the corner. They took the last of it with them. The house was quiet. My name was clean. The foundation had held. I drew in a breath of morning air, turned the handle, and went inside. 6 months have gone by since that freezing autumn night when the federal cruisers lit up my street and the darkest chapter of my life came to its end. The justice that followed was swift and absolute, a direct consequence of the hard drives I had placed in that agent's hands. The federal courts moved like a precision instrument. Nolan and Celeste were stripped of their manufactured wealth and their arrogant certainty in equal measure. With their own voices on tape and the full ledger of their crimes laid out in digital form, their expensive legal team had no ground to stand on. The trial was brief, a clean clinical dismantling. I sat in the front row and watched with the detached focus of a man reading a failure analysis report. Nolan never once turned to look at me. He sat with his shoulders caved inward, hollowed out. Celeste wept openly as the life she had schemed to build evaporated into the reality of a concrete cell. The judge extended no leniency to a son who had engineered with cold deliberation the financial and legal destruction of his own father. Nolan and Celeste were each sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. They will serve every one of those years confined in steel and concrete, cut off entirely from the luxury they tried to purchase with my life. The overseas syndicate they had served was dismantled from top to bottom. The cascading federal indictments triggered by those unedited hard drives shattered their domestic network entirely. The men who had treated my property as a dumping ground for their crimes are now facing the weight of lifetime sentences. My property was legally restored to my name through the rapid nullification of the fraudulent deed Nolan had orchestrated with such confidence. But walking through those rooms once the dust had settled, I understood that the house itself was finished for me. Every polished surface and familiar corner now reflected only the calculated deception of the two people I had trusted most. The place had become a monument to betrayal, not a home. I made my decision quickly and without hesitation. I put the property on the market and it sold within days at a strong profit. I packed only what carried genuine meaning and left everything else, every shadow, every echo of what had happened there behind for good. I simplified my life considerably. I bought a comfortable, well-appointed condominium, sitting directly on the calm shore of a pristine lake set among dense timber just outside the city. Ridgecrest Pines Manor had been a chapter. This was something else entirely, a place built on clean ground. Quiet mornings, natural light coming off the water, the soft sound of it against the dock when I wake up with none of the dread that used to greet me each day. The proceeds from the property sale gave me something beyond financial stability. They gave me a purpose. I hadn't forgotten the cold terror that moved through me when Nolan calmly outlined his plan to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized. What chilled me most was how simple it had been for him to attempt it, how easily the legal system could be aimed at an elderly parent by a child willing to exploit it. I had survived because I had the mental sharpness, the resources, and the right allies. Most people in my position don't. They face the same predatory schemes with no protection and no recourse. Their own family members hollow them out, and there is no one positioned to stop it. I chose to take the pain of what had happened to me and build something from it that could absorb that kind of blow for someone else. I put the full proceeds of the real estate sale into a legal defense fund, a dedicated institution built specifically to fight for elderly men and women confronting predatory financial abuse and coerced guardianship. We have a team of tenacious, highly specialized attorneys and forensic financial investigators who go after corrupt caretakers and opportunistic relatives with everything available to them. I spend my mornings working through case files, applying 40 years of analytical engineering instinct to the job of identifying exactly where someone else's carefully constructed lies begin to fracture. We build airtight cases for the people who come to us, frameworks designed so that no arrogant opportunist can dismantle them. The grief of losing my son is real, and I carry it, but it has been quietly overtaken by something far more sustaining, the work of making certain that what was done to me cannot be done to someone else without consequence. Every time we successfully overturn a fraudulent power of attorney, something deep in me settles a quiet vindication that never gets old. This afternoon, warm golden sunlight skips across the gentle ripples of the lake in front of me. I'm sitting back in a small aluminum fishing boat, the easy rocking of the hull beneath me, working like a slow metronome against the stillness of the day. Aldous is at the other end, relaxed methodically, working his bright green lure toward a stand of submerged reeds along the rocky bank. We don't say much. We don't need to. There is a particular brand of silence that can only exist between two men who have walked through genuine darkness, side by side, and come out the other end, and that is what settles between us now. He is a rare thing, a truly steadfast friend, the kind who doesn't step back when the worst of what humanity can produce shows up at your door. I draw in a slow breath of the clean air and let the stillness move through me. The landscape spread out around this serene lake stands in sharp and magnificent contrast to the concrete and steel currently surrounding my son. I close my eyes for a moment and listen a solitary loon calling somewhere across the wide, shimmering water, its voice carrying clean and clear in the cold air. When I look down at my hands resting on the fishing rod, I see what a long and demanding life leaves behind: weathered skin, deep lines, old scars. But as I watch them hold the rod, one thing is unmistakable. They are completely steady, no trembling from fear, no shaking from regret. These are the hands of a structural engineer who understood at the moment it mattered most, exactly how to bring down a compromised structure before it could collapse on top of him. What carried me through the betrayal wasn't fury or desperation. It was patience, discipline, and the firm refusal to accept the role of victim. I let my enemies dig with confidence, and I held the weight steady above them until the moment was right to drop it. As the sun descends behind the tall pines edging the horizon and long shadows stretch out across the calm water, a quiet smile finds my face. That chapter is closed, and I know with a clarity that feels almost peaceful, my life is far from finished. Never confuse the calm manner of an old man for ignorance or weakness. What a lifetime of hard experience, struggle, and survival builds inside a person is something no arrogant opportunist ever sees coming. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Honor Revenge Stories. If this story reached something in you, I hope you'll carry a piece of it forward. Looking back on everything that happened, I won't pretend it didn't leave marks. Losing a son not to death but to the person he chose to become is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself all at once. It arrives slowly in quiet moments, long after the handcuffs and the courtrooms and the federal trucks have come and gone. What I know now is that I believe God placed the right people in my path at exactly the right moments. Mr. Cranwell's broken warning, Aldous' steady hand, the patience that held me together long enough to see it through. None of it was coincidence. Here is what I took from this, and what I pass on to you. Never sign a document you haven't read in full, no matter who hands it to you or how much you trust them. Love is not a substitute for due diligence. If something feels wrong, it usually is. An unexplained detail, an odd phrase, a stranger's warning, pay attention. Your instincts were built by a lifetime of experience. Use them. Patience is a weapon. Panic hands your enemy the advantage. Stillness, preparation, and time will dismantle what rage never could. And finally, do not let anyone convince you that your age makes you easy to defeat. For every adult 50-plus man or woman who has been written off as too old, too slow, or too trusting to fight back, I want you to hear this clearly. A lifetime of hard lessons sharpens a mind in ways no opportunist can predict. This has been a family revenge story in the truest sense, not built on anger but on love for what is right and the refusal to let a greedy child rewrite a life honestly built. If this family revenge story moved you or reminded you of someone you know, please share it with them. They may need to hear it more than you realize. Subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you never miss what comes next. And leave me a comment, tell me what you took from this one. I read every word. Thank you. Until next time, take care of yourself.